Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Revolution in Education. I am your host, Jim McCue. We'll be joined by a wonderful group of educational reformers and leaders in just a second, but I just wanted to introduce you to these amazing folks in the education world before we get started on the actual interview questions. Of course, we'll be joined by Chris Unger, as usual, as you've seen in other episodes, but today we have Dr. Claire Brown, the National Director of AVID Australia at Victoria University in Melbourne. We also have Vanessa Wilkins, the founder of Future School Lab and an expert in residence at Harvard Innovation Lab. She's an expert on sparking and scaling innovation in education so that all kids can be prepared for the future. And finally, we have Dr. Matt Coleman, who is currently the CEO of Inflexion. His focus is on school systems change, which has produced demonstrable results. All of his work is rooted in organizational theory, and it's informed by his extensive experience working at every level of the secondary education system. Today, you'll hear a really great conversation about the levers that we can all take, especially education leaders, to create schools that serve all students holistically here in the US and abroad. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Let's get to it. I wanted to jump into things, especially in terms of our essential question. Chris will also be piping in with some questions as well. I would love to hear a little bit more about each of your backgrounds and just hear a little bit more about what got you into education and what you're doing now more specifically.
I had no choice, really. Education's in my DNA. I'm a third generation teacher and the fourth generation started teaching last year. So I tried really hard not to be in education initially. I tried to be an actress, but realized that I had a more captive audience if I actually taught. And actually that was a far more meaningful, for me, it was a more meaningful profession because I got to learn the art and craft of teaching over time. And at the same time, I could also be supporting students who really needed the relationships and the opportunities to learn and the different way of looking at education that was of interest to me. So it's been a lifelong journey, and I think education is, and I think teaching as a art and craft is a lifelong experience of learning.
Will you say more about the Victoria Institute and what's happening at university and also AVID in Australia? Because she is the...
Yes. Victoria University is actually in the middle of its own revolution at the moment. We've gone to a completely block model of teaching. It's the biggest block experiment in the world. So there's been a few universities in the US and South Africa, I think, Canada, UK, that have done the block model of teaching on a smaller scale. But in Australia, in Victoria University, we've blocked our whole university, which I think is about 30-odd thousand students now in block in both a vocational education pathway and higher education, because we're a dual sector university. And when we went to that block model, it became apparent that we had a really big elephant in our university, which was academics weren't trained teachers. And we were now putting them in a classroom situation where the classes are capped at 30 and the students are coming for 3-hour sessions 3 times a week. So the old stand at the front and deliver your lecture model that you've done for the last 20 years wasn't going to cut it. Everyone was going to die of extreme boredom. So the university came to me and said, you do this AVID thing, right? It's professional learning. Can you do some professional learning for the university for people who are going to teach in the block? At the same time, we also collapsed the structure that was everybody teaching in their discipline colleges in first year. We realised that students who come to university in first year are 3 months away from having been year 12 students. That transition is huge for many of them, particularly if they're first in family. So we created this entity called the first year college. And the point of the college is you come into that college prepared to teach, and your research is second to that. And you come into the college with the mindset of, I teach students, my discipline comes second. So it's a focus on pedagogy rather than content. So that necessitated a whole lot of continuous professional learning as well. And I am in charge of the AVID system, which is a very successful professional learning system in the US, 40 years now in existence. Matt and Vanessa have both done some work with AVID. And I was lucky enough to be able to bring AVID into Australia about 11 years ago. And so that's why we were able to access the AVID professional learning system to completely retrain academics at Victoria University to do this very highly revolutionary thing of actually teaching students first and foremost and blocking the whole university.
This revolution that you're speaking of not only applies to K-12 schools, as Chris and I focus on, it should be happening in higher education, and the amount of students that anticipate graduating on time ends up being a huge issue, because there's a lot of things that go into students feeling not only prepared when they graduate from high school, but also that they have the support, the coaching, all the structures around them to succeed. And it sounds like that first year approach, the pedagogical intention around how students are experiencing learning authentically is something that you were super mindful of. How were you able to develop that collaboration with others in that space to ensure that it's sustainable, scalable, and falling on ears that welcome it?
Well, necessity is a great motivator. Our university was not in a good way, and this was before the pandemic, so we needed to do something different. We only have about 39 universities across all of Australia, and competition is fierce. There are 8 universities in Victoria, and ours was struggling. So the Vice-Chancellor, the President of the university, and the council decided that they would back this idea to go block and to focus on teaching, because we're a university that serves a population who are largely diverse and disadvantaged background, first in family students. With the University of the West is one of our taglines. And the west of Melbourne has traditionally been blue collar, not usually university focused people, but the world is changing. So the necessity of having to do something different, and the concern of our university has always been to serve communities for whom university was not their first or obvious choice. So we had to be mindful of what do they need to be successful in this space, and what do they bring, more importantly, that we can build on. So what are the strengths they already have that are not always recognised as being strengths, and how do we adapt our teaching? What's the problem we have as academics and teachers that we need to change, including our mindsets, to serve these students better? So it was a big revolution, and I'm only a small part in that transition, but the choice of the person to lead the college and become the dean of the first year college was a masterstroke. He's been an incredibly inspirational leader for those people. The university as a system backing the change and putting resources and funding behind that was significant. Then recruiting about 100 academics who said, okay, I'll risk everything about my career and jump into this first year college thing, and we'll co-create it. So it's a very different space, but it's been the collaboration across the university of lots of people that have made it the success that it is. And we're still learning and we're still building.
That's one thing that I'd love to hear from others to respond to. Matt and Vanessa, Chris, you can jump in. Is this idea of a deficit mindset when we try to apply certain standards to students attending college, our expectations, whether we unconsciously or consciously apply those standards, those viewpoints, the perspectives, the cultures, the identities of all students entering the collegiate space, how we reflect ourselves on standardized testing, and how we evaluate the portfolio of what makes up the totality of a student. I don't think it's properly articulated and appreciated. So I love the fact that you are addressing that and you're getting dollars devoted to it, because we know that ideas are one thing, but to get it fully funded, it's another thing. And the people behind this work are the lifeblood. And sometimes you really just need to be able to fund those programs because those are salaries and support structures and sustainable institutions that allow everyone to feel comfortable that this will exist in perpetuity. Anybody else have thoughts to the beautiful work that Claire is doing, or a follow-up?
I think I'd double down on something she said, and this is a big part of the work that we do at Inflexion. It's been a big part of our organization, which is focused on the concept of college and career readiness for over 20 years now, is the idea that when you begin to think holistically about the concept of readiness, you begin to invite in other strengths to be that point of leverage. And you get out of this deficit mindset. And our work is primarily with middle and high school, secondary, and we focus on secondary school change. But what we find, and I'll use this as an illustration, we often impart another deficit. We need our kids to develop grit. And we're saying that about our grittiest kids. And that's because we don't think in a holistic framing. We talk about soft skills. They aren't soft. They're trending. They are the 21st century skills. And so I love what as Claire referenced it at her university, I love that recognition that to shift out of a deficit mindset and into a strength-based mindset requires us to think differently about the fact that we are teaching the whole student. One activity that we do, and we've done it literally with over 10,000 people, and I joke because we did it with Nike executives and some work that we did in partnership with the Nike School Innovation Fund and Vanessa. We've done it with AVID teachers in Australia at their national conference that I've been lucky enough to attend. And we've done it with families and parents in schools that are opening, so brand new schools, and specifically a couple of high schools here in Oregon. And we ask them, how would you want to describe students as they walk across the stage at graduation, ready for life, college, career, but life? And take 7 or 8 different attributes that you'd want to use as descriptors. And then we map them against a holistic vision for readiness, which we call Think, Know, Act, Go. And it's think is really focused on critical thinking and creativity. Know is your classic content knowledge and skills. And your access skills like reading, writing, and math. Act is really around ownership of learning and elements of being able to communicate and to collaborate and to be goal-oriented and take on kind of that ownership of the learning process. And then go is really understanding who you are in the context of the ever-changing world around you. Well, when we ask people to identify the attributes, we have them map them against Think, Know, Act, Go. And we then ask them, identify the one attribute that's been the key to your success. And we let them define what success is, personally, professionally, as a parent, as a partner, whatever. You define what success is, but identify the one. 90 to 95% of the 10,000 people we've done this with across the broad spectrum of types of people in terms of their positionality within the education system, have 90 to 95%, it's in think, act, and go. And to say it the way Claire said it, that's teaching to the student. That's developing the ability to collaborate. That's helping students develop a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing who I am in the context of the world around me. Agency, you can throw all these different terms out there. But what's fascinating is we've literally done this with 10,000 plus people. And every time it's the same. 90 to 95% are think, act, and go. And yet those attributes in that 90 to 95%, they don't find themselves in traditional accountability systems. You'll see 90% of what's on the Oregon report card for schools is focused on no. And yet when you ask people what's been the key to their success and what's been the attributes that's propelled them, they aren't even measured. And so, it fits with what Claire, I think, is getting at in the transformation there. We would argue, and the work we do with principals is trying to transform secondary schools such that the student experience is one that embraces a holistic vision, plays to strengths, and develops the whole student. And that's where I think our work, and I know our partnership with Claire and her work specifically to AVID implementation in Australia just totally aligns, because we call it an anchor. There's two anchors, and one of them that we see for an effective school is this idea of a shared vision for readiness.
Beautiful. And I do have a follow-up on that, Matt. I think what you're talking about, especially in terms of self-identity and the work that's being done by students and teachers and school administrators, requires a deep critical conversation around consciousness, not only of your system that you're building for your students to thrive in, so that their identity is not only felt for themselves to be appreciated, which is a huge lift for many students that are going through these emotional teenage years, but also for teachers to recognize that as an appreciation, not in a deficit-oriented way, but in an asset-oriented way. And I'm hearing a lot of partnering in the work that you've identified. And I think that goes with continuous improvement. You can't get to any type of work, or frankly, part of the work is sitting down and having a meal first. So and then you can talk about, well, what are the root causes of why we assess this way? And how is that misaligned with the way we act in our everyday life and this archaic notion of how we assess things? Of what you've talked about with no, 90 to 95% being think, act, know resonates with me.
Our systems are designed around some archaic notions of what students need to know, and towards what end. It doesn't seem like schools are designed around the ends that will benefit students the best, but sort of like an antiquated workforce paradigm that is no longer with us in any way, in an industrial way. I think that any of us will probably believe and agree that what we want to do is help the student identify and think about their own pursuits and their own wishes and their own dreams and their own desires and how they can materialize that. And I would add, probably we could talk a little bit about this, how they can give back to the world. So it resonates a lot with me. I would love to hear a little bit about, like, what does it really take for a school or school leader or entire school to take the courage to make the leap and to, I would actually say, think, act, and go differently. How do you get the community to think, act, and go differently towards other ends for students? And then if it's possible, leap back to Claire and say, how do some of these ideas go back to around the world, the other part of the world, and what they're doing, because it's not just something good for Oregon, right? And it's not just something good for high school students.
Right.
I actually make the argument it's good for any person. So I don't know. That's a lot of stuff. So yeah, love to hear exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, I would put this out there. I think there's a great level of frustration and recognition that the system is producing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to privilege some and obstruct others or oppress others. And it's working for fewer and fewer and fewer kids. And was never designed to work for all. And so I think the impetus and the want and the will is there. It's the how. And we don't actually start with looking at assessment systems, kind of the classic levers. Let's look at grading practices and whatnot. We actually start, and we work with school leaders to start by engaging their broader community to develop a shared vision for readiness. The protocol I mentioned was something principals use and superintendents use in communities to really surface the fact that think, act, and go is what the community desires. It's and wants in terms of an outcome. We then also work and work with schools to get really clear with their organizational identity, their school identity, and to have it be community centered, but the values and the beliefs and the mental models, the way they see the world. And I'll give you an example from secondary, and this is a huge piece for us in terms of how you support all kids. One of the things, fatal flaws in the U.S. and is that secondary schools were designed to support independent contractors working independently. And it goes back to our fixation on the no. The kids are going to come to me, not for me to teach them. I taught physics. They're going to come to me to teach them content knowledge. And they'll go from me to, the teacher next door who's teaching them English. And we don't connect content wise. And the system was designed for that. We always say it's independent contractors working independently. And the reality is kids are complex. And as we've stated, when you have a vision for readiness that has think, act, and go, you need to create the opportunities for our work to be dependent on each other's work. And so the two anchors for us and where we start is really trying to ground the community in a clear sense of identity, values and beliefs and mental models, the way they see the world, and then a shared vision for readiness that's holistic. And then once those anchors are set, you start to try to align your approaches to learning to your vision for readiness, and you take your structures and you say, you look at two things. Does it support the approaches to learning that align with our vision for readiness? And then you reflect back and say, in terms of identity, do our structures actually reflect our values and our beliefs and the ways that we see the world? And I'll tell you point blank, we've been engaged with a couple hundred schools over the last 4 or 5 years. And there's about 10 to 15 that are absolutely knocking it out of the park for all kids. And those are schools that clearly know who they are. They have clarity of identity. They have a shared vision for readiness, a consensus of outcomes, if you will. And they've aligned their structures and their approaches to learning. And that is the kind of work we're doing with principals at the secondary level, having launched a community, a networked improvement community. We've got 47 schools we're working with right now, post-pandemic, in terms of a virtual delivery. Our vision is we're going to add another 50 next year. We've got one more year of development, and then we're going to look to scale to 400 or 500 schools. But with the mindset that they are anchored, they've got clarity of who they are, what they're about, their mental models, and they've got the shared holistic vision for readiness. We're agnostic. AVID's awesome. IB's awesome. AP's awesome. I mean, you can go down the list. PBL, great, it's awesome. Place-based education, it's all good. We're agnostic to the how. The question for us and what we've seen work is when somebody's how has been informed by who they are and what they're trying to get done, that's where we see success. It all kind of comes back to, and I think, Claire, I love the way you said it, that we teach kids and we teach kids content. And when we think about teaching kids, we've got to think holistically. That's got to be the center of the work.
I just want to pop in too and just say, I think I know what data Matt's talking about when he talks about the data of schools that really have made a difference. And they, at Inflexion, they have a really world-class research and evaluation team. They're skilled at measuring all sorts of things, including SEL, but they looked at growth, right? It was growth measures for disaggregated subgroups over time in the schools that have implemented the Inflexion approach. And it was outstanding. I mean, they really outperformed their peers in a dramatic way that you could see on a graph.
The work of continuous improvement is establishing a network effect that is appreciative of school culture, identity, establishing like how best to teach our kids so that we're doing it on a holistic level. But then we think about sustainability and the various levers that you want to like tap into or pull within the system that you're now co-creating organically. What are the standards of accountability? How are you building empowered voices? And what's the demand by community members, parents, and students alike?
If I jump in at that point, I think there's a really big elephant in this room. And these schools are all doing a great job to shift our education system from the massification of learning, which it was designed for in the industrial setting, to a personalisation and contextualisation of learning. And as Matt said so well, we are so far behind shifting the systemic thinking in that approach, but there are enlightened teachers because they're at the coalface and leaders who know they have to do that. And the system isn't supporting them because by and large, our systems are still generating really poor quality education policies that are designed around silver bullets and one size fits no one policies. And that's what we've got in Australia, where you can have a really ingenious education policy, but if it doesn't fit what the system wants generated, they will kill it or they will bury it. And it doesn't matter if it was good or not. If it doesn't fit what the system's pushing at that time, it goes nowhere. And not only that, it's buried and you can never find anything about it ever again because those documents, those policy documents are hidden. So we've got countless examples of really good education innovations that almost happened, but then they were killed by the system because it wasn't ready for those innovations to come forward. And that's a really big problem. I think the quality of education policy in our country is lacking. And when that's not there, then principals and leaders can only work within the policies that they have to follow because they ultimately have to be accountable to their system. And so they've got these dual challenges of trying to meet the needs of their community and the context in which they work and the students who attend their schools who don't look like what that policy is describing they need to produce. So it's huge pressure on leaders and the mental illness rate for principals in Australia is really significant. And I think it's because they're really struggling with the oppositional forces that are on them from both the system and then really being attuned to their communities.
Well, can I follow up on that, Claire? Because I think this is a very important point. I don't think we can actually wait too long for our enlightenment around our policy and policy systems. There is a policy environment, and as much as we wish that the policy environment would be different, and the expectations would be different, the accountability measures would be all different, the reality is we can't wait for enlightenment in the policy system, right? So I think this is one of the important things that I'm really glad you brought it up, because, one of the questions as we think about a revolution is we can say, okay, let's make sure that the policy systems are different. But in reality, we can't wait generations for those policy systems to change. So Claire, from your vantage point, and Matt, yours, and Vanessa, I'm a principal, or I'm a district leader, or I'm a school leader, I'm a teacher. There are these specific accountability measures that I have to address, but I want to push the envelope. What advice or insights would you have about having that dance? It feels like a tango, a very messy, difficult tango to a really bad song.
A great description. I think you're right, because for the schools that took on AVID in Australia, that was not departmentally derived system of education. So the principals who first opted into AVID did that dance. They had to work out how being an AVID school satisfied the accountability requirements of their department, because they could generate the data and show the progress that was required on the measures, usually blunt instruments that the department has required that they report on. At the same time, a system like AVID or IB or any of the others allows the principal to lead a pedagogical approach that is student-centred, allows teachers to have continuous professional learning, and allows the community to come along with them as they contextualise education for the community they serve. So it is a dance, and sometimes you've got two left feet, and sometimes it's really hard to stay in rhythm.
Rage against the machine. I don't know. I don't know any other way to kind of say it. I mean, it's interesting. I'll probably say too much, but we were the Educational Policy Improvement Center. That was Inflexion before 7 years ago, or actually 6 years ago. I think we officially changed the name at some point in the last 6 years, from the Educational Policy Improvement Center to Inflexion. And a big part of when I came here, we've done policy innovation and policy research and and whatnot. And when I was asked by our founder to come over, to come on board from my role as an assistant superintendent in a local district, I said yes and my if was if we can do practice-based work, because I had seen in my 20 plus years at the secondary level, 20 years of all kinds of different policy levers being pulled and no change. So it was just, for me, it was like, okay, we can innovate, and improve policy. I've never seen it actually have the effect. What I hope and desire, and this idea of getting to a community of 500, is that our innovative practices can start to push on the policies. Now, that said, when I mentioned that, the 200 schools and the 15 that are knocking it out of the park, they're knocking it out of the park on the classic measures, the classic outcome measures that all the policy levers have been trying to affect change and trying to positively impact different groups of students. These schools are killing it, and none of them are going in with this fixation on those outcomes. One of the best schools that I've ever seen is a school in Hawaii on the Big Island that, long story short, half of their students' week is in traditional classrooms. The other half of the week is student-centered, community-based work. The percentage, the outcomes for their Native Hawaiian students specifically, as a group in comparison to the rest of the Hawaiian system, is out of this world, including matriculation and success post-secondary. And yet their approach to learning, you would have never been able to kind of, from a policy standpoint, pull a policy lever to create that. Our mindset and in our work with principals is you got to rage against the machine. Now, don't get me wrong. We like the term, look for measures of responsibility, systemic responsibility. And a great example, it's really hard, impossible to measure in a classic kind of accountability framing, social emotional learning. It is simple to measure whether kids are having the opportunity to develop socio-emotionally within a school. Those are really easy measures of responsibility that we can use to construct a system that supports the kind of practices that lead to learning. And our belief is you don't learn if you don't engage. You don't engage if you don't connect. You don't connect if you don't belong. And yet classic accountability fixates on the learning and provides no, strategic kind of leading indicator measures of responsibility. Are we ensuring that all kids have a feeling of belonging, are connected, are engaged? So that's where we're trying to shift the thinking. The other piece, and I'll say this hopefully quickly, there's policy and there's politics. And I was a large high school principal for a number of years. And the reality is, if I played the politics of my immediate community, we could pretty much do whatever we needed to be done, as long as it was in line with what the community's identity was and what the community wanted. I'm talking families, I'm talking other community stakeholders. And it wasn't that I could just totally poo-poo everything else, but from a policy standpoint, I made sure that I was playing the politics and not necessarily the policy. And I think there's a distinction there, which is why I drive or encourage the principals we're working with, to really ground themselves and their work and the work of the school in the identity of the community and what the community's desires are.
This is, I think, where my private sector sort of perspective comes in. There's a old saying in the private sector, which is as a leader, the most important thing you can do is hire good people and get out of their way. And I think we don't do that in education, right? That's where policymakers can focus. They can focus on the teacher pipeline, making sure that we're recruiting people with a lived experience that match our students, who have the aptitudes, not the knowledge or the content, expertise, but the aptitudes to work with kids and help them find their strengths and succeed. And that's where the policymakers' time should be spent, not on focusing on whether or not they learned calculus or, the content focus. So, and I just want to bring in Finland, since we were trying to make this a global conversation. Yeah. One of the things that I thought was so fabulous, Finland totally follows this. They don't have any nationalized standardized tests, right? And yet they have outperformed most of their countries in the PISA. They've declined a little bit in the last few years. We could talk about why that is, but it's not as relevant as saying the average school, and in fact, the universal quality, like the difference between all the different schools across the country is quite low. And they're all very, very high quality, but they're really good at producing consistent results across the entire country. And they do it because they focus on the teaching cadre and then giving them the power and autonomy to do what kids need in that local community. And then, of course, they connect it to everything. They look at kids holistically. They understand the importance of having adults in their lives, et cetera. But I think that's where policymakers in the US go wrong. There's so much focus on accountability measures that don't actually matter to kids or their families or their communities or employers once they get out, right? Nobody's ever asked me what my SAT score was. I'd probably be really embarrassed if they did. But I think that's where we get it wrong in the US.
I'm going to circle back to the beginning of this thing. I think this is what I'm hearing, and see how you guys respond to this. I'm hearing that we have students coming in, and the immediate question is, what deficits do they have? They can't do this, they can't do that, they can't do this math, they can't do this, they can't write, they can't read, they don't know, U.S. history, they don't know, on and on and on. So we decided we will build these factories, and they're sort of like widgets, and we plug and play with the widgets to make sure that they have the knowledge. This is the no, Matt. Yep. This is the no, right? Yep. And we make sure that again. And then what happens is the community or the parent body, and this happens in particularly high performing or high socioeconomic contexts. I was talking with somebody about this recently. They want to know that the factory is a really good factory. It's better than most factories. And the way you judge it is how many are going to college, but not just that, what are the GRE scores? What are the SAT scores? So they're judging the factory by the output. But what I'm hearing from you is that you're basically saying, let's actually concern ourselves with each individual learner. Who are we working with? And I didn't say teaching. It's an important point, because teaching means I'm giving somebody something or I'm passing on content to somebody. But how am I focused on the learner and the development of the learner as a person, as an individual? And how am I helping them think about their own identity and their own desire for where they want to go, what they want to do in life, what are their interests, what are their passions? And we're changing the paradigm from teacher-centered, content-centered, deficit-centered to learner-centered. Who is this person? Who is this person in development? How can I interact with this person? And the dance continues because we can't get rid of the bad music. But I really like what Matt said is, I can't change the policy environment, but we can start to engage the community to say, what do we want for each of our youth, each of our people? I didn't say student. I wanted to get away from that. How are we supporting, assisting the development of the individuals as learners, looking forward to the future around how they can pursue their future lives in a meaningful way? And if you can, this is the point that I really like, Matt, if we can engage the community to change their own paradigm of what we should be looking at, what we should be focusing on, how can we assist and support each learner and give them the capacity to have agency to mobilize and move in the directions they want in their lives, then we have been successful. But if we keep having students with deficits and factories that focus on larger outcomes of accountability that have nothing to do with what youth really need to think about the lives they want to live and how they can pursue them, we are at a severe disadvantage. So then the question is, what do you do? And I think, Matt, your point is, how do you engage the community so they're shifting their own mindset, their own perspective, their own paradigm of what we should be doing as a community of adults and educators that are serving those youth, not serving the policies.
I think you're spot on. And I think the piece that Matt was referencing, the policy and the politics piece, is really critical in there. Because until we get education off the political agenda, where in Australia, it's a political football every election time. There's a bazillion promises made, many of which never come to fruition or are not the right promises anyway. And they use it for vote scoring and point scoring off each other. If we could make education truly non-partisan and take some of the politics out of it, that would go a long way to addressing the quality of the music in the dance, to use your metaphor. And also recognizing, as Matt said right from the beginning, students are complex. Education is complex. We've got to get away from binary measures that are blunt instruments of how we rate education and how we do education. It's not about phonics or whole language. It's about using the right strategy for the kids at the right moment as they progress in their learning of literacy. And we've forever been using binaries and blunt instruments of success and failure when education's far more complex and it's a big ecosystem. So the politics does have to change around that to recognize that we're not going to they're wicked problems in education. They do not have quick fix solutions, and it requires everybody in the community to be working towards the needs of every student, because it's not okay to use statistics that say 95% of the kids are okay. If my kid's in that 5%, that's not okay. And it's not okay to me if your kid's in that 5%. We are not talking about widgets. We are talking about human beings who make a contribution to our world, and it's up to us to make sure they have every opportunity to make the very best contribution they can, because we got out of their way, to use Vanessa's point, and we let them flourish and be the best they could be.
I also want to say that I hadn't disregarded your comment, Vanessa, and I want to get back to that and that framework that I just tried to pull together out of a hat. I think that many people, at least in the past, have gone into education saying, I'm going into education to make a difference in a child's life. But then they get into the factory and they're realizing they're a factory worker and they're actually not really given the affordance to really they do it between the cracks. They do it in the hallway and how they invite students in. But for the most, though, the paradigm of teaching has certain people going into teaching. And some people might not like that, but I think there is a paradigm of what happens in schools. And there are people who are saying, oh, I can do that. I can hand down content. I can teach youth. But if you change the paradigm to thinking that my role and responsibility is to see the child, see the person, build relationships, and become a mentor and a facilitator of their growth and development, the paradigm is completely different. And so I think it's not about paying teachers more, although I would argue that's a good thing to do. But I think it's about changing the paradigm and inviting those people who will say, this is how I would like to work with you. This is how I want to use my life to give back and nurture and support the development of these individuals, as Claire points out. Not fixing widgets and plugging in content, but wrapping your arms around these youth and developmentally giving them what they need, and doing that not in isolated classrooms, going back to Matt's point, but how does a community come together to embrace 100, 200, 300 youth and think about the community they can build so that those youth can grow inside that community. It's a completely different paradigm. And so we first need to figure out how to build those communities, then showcase those communities, and then invite others who had not been thinking about the possibility of them being in those communities to really assist and support those youth that's a big transition.
That's the wicked problem. I mean, and one of the things that you're getting at that is challenging. So yes, yes, and yes to relationship. Our little whatever hashtag is know the name, face, and story. Well, the reason people come out, get into education, I think to make that difference at the kid level, to be in relationship, to know kids. Yeah, they've got the content, but I believe this. I mean, teachers have a heart for the youth, right? But they get into a system where they've got 170 students who they see for 48 minutes, every day. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so what ends up happening is independent contractors working independently. And so, that's a big part of the work we look to do. And I believe in trying to figure out how to transform, honestly, specifically secondary education, not totally blow it up. I used to advocate, we just got to blow the system up. And I'd love to do that if it was reasonable. But when you talk about the politics of a community, it's really hard to just blow up. And so the issue, and I'll use an example. I mean, we work with two schools in particular that have 3,700 kids. And it was recently went into about 8 classrooms. And I chose the 4, they showed me 4 absolutely amazing teachers doing amazing work. And we got out in the hallway and I said to the principal and the assistant principal who were giving me the tour and let me see teachers and whatnot. And I said, here's the issue. I said, those 4 were phenomenal. But the only way that I would know they were at Pittsburgh High School is the fact that we stepped out into this hallway. So if the only thing connecting classrooms in a large comprehensive high school is the hallways, you're not getting the job done. I didn't see shared rituals and routines. I didn't see, an anchoring to something like knowing thyself. We'd argue that's the 21st century set of knowledge that every kid should walk away with, is having a sense of purpose. I didn't see the continuity in language and/or rituals and routines. And that's what those schools are working towards. And we joke about it, saying, it's little things. What could you have done yesterday? What could you do tomorrow? Just to start to do a bunch of little things to connect a bunch of heroic efforts at the teacher level, but none of which are connected. And that's the work that we're doing with the schools. That's the community we're trying to build. Would I love to be able to say, hey, let's repurpose schools. Let's start from scratch and let's have the primary purpose of school being knowing thyself. And then let's build a structure, the structures and the policies and the practices to align with that. Oh, that'd be awesome. But right now we got a bunch of kids in big box high schools and little box high schools, because we see the same thing in small, rural, remote, where the policymakers have driven all of these very independent requirements. That's the stuff that we're looking to shift. But to your point, I mean, it would be a dream to think that we can get there, and we have to be working. I love the fact that Claire's university, I mean, just from a university standpoint, that end game, where a lot of kids from, I think it was, you said West Melbourne, would be going there, that they're going to a structure that then the K-12 can align with in a very different way. But it's fascinating to think about, and it's challenging to actually do. And it makes for a wicked problem, which is fun to work on. But we need to move. I mean, we're doing a disservice to more and more kids as we continue just to plug away with a system that wasn't designed to serve all kids well.
I hear the sense of urgency in all of your voices, and the shift that needs to happen. It needs to be a realignment, and you're all working on very important ways of uniquely identifying these problems that are facing all of us, and the need for addressing them and solving through a collaborative model, as Claire, you've mentioned. Matt, thinking about it through this system structure, and then Vanessa, your work tying in this larger global perspective and what's out there for us to pursue. What are the best practices that we can learn from, and how do we craft those in a contextualized, holistic way for all students to recognize their growth, both in themselves, but the community at large as well, so that when you step into a classroom, Matt, and then out into the hallway, there's coherence there. For those that have been listening to this engaging conversation, we've had Claire Brown with us, Matt Coleman, and Vanessa Wilkins, along with Chris Unger. This is another episode of A Revolution in Education, but I would like to allow our interviewees one last final thought. No pressure. We welcome it at this time.
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Jim and Chris, for bringing us all together again. And you're absolutely right. None of us can do this in our own silos. We have far more in common in what we need to achieve in allowing students to be their best selves in a global community, which means we all have to be cognizant of what each of us are doing and being able to help those students achieve their best selves. So thank you for the opportunity. And it is a joy to work with Matt and Vanessa. I feel very privileged in that space too.
It's beautiful. Thanks, Claire.
Likewise, I would say the same as Claire, and well, thank you all for bringing us together. And the work needs to happen. I've got a daughter who right now is a high school dropout. Her mom's a special educator. I've been a principal and assistant soup and doing what I'm doing now, and she didn't go beyond her sophomore year. And she had has a specific disability in math, and it was the system that basically said, oh, you need to be double dosed. And even as parents, we kind of bought in. We didn't kind of rage against the system. And the reality is she was systematically excluded from being in the choir. She was systematically excluded from being in the child development CTE pathway. So when I think about this, I mean, for me, it's a bit deeply personal in terms of a level of conviction that we have to stop telling different groups of kids they are not able, that their wants and their passion and developing a sense of who they are and a sense of their own purpose is secondary to a certain math score on a large scale assessment or a certain level of mathematics or. We have to stop doing that. And so I thank you all for bringing us together to talk a little bit about the work we do, with the end game being to ensure that all kids play to their strengths and achieve and are able to go out in the world and do amazing things and not feel like they're less than.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for sharing that, Matt. That it brings it back to the reality for all of us. I think there's such an urgency, and I am just grateful to be having this conversation. And I do think we can learn from each other in the next classroom, in the next school, in the next town, in the next state, in the next country, because there's a lot of really great stuff happening for kids, but it's not happening for all kids, and we've got to address that. We can't afford to keep wasting our time.
Beautiful ending to that, Vanessa. Thank you so much. Chris, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I'm appreciative, Claire, Matt, Vanessa, the work you do. I do think there's so many people working on this, and we just need to rally and go arm to arm and do everything we can together and try to shine a light on the fact that we need a different system of education and a different paradigm of thinking about how we really support our youth to become who they can become and who they want to become and to do what they want to do in the world.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That's, again, another episode of A Revolution in Education. Thank you all. Have a great evening, morning, wherever you're calling in from. Take care.